Mr. Henson.
Okay, thank you, and thank you everyone for being here. The two items that we will be discussing this afternoon are separate funds, and you can see that's how we've termed them on the agenda. The first, we'll go through the Federal Programs and Grants Fund. This is flow-through funding from the federal government, typically flowing through the state onto local school districts. Many times it's very prescriptive in nature as far as how you can spend the dollars. Some may say those are the strings that are attached, and that would be accurate. And also I want to point out that the federal fiscal year is October 1st through November 30th, and so very difficult at this point in time in March to really know exactly what's going to be approved for a fiscal year that won't begin for 3 months after our fiscal year begins on July 1st. But with that being said, if you would take the document, the first document that's underneath the agenda for our committee meeting, the cover sheet says Federal Programs and Grants, and behind it is a one-page summary. And we always have included a one-page summary at this point in time, based on what I just said, to show the different types of grants that the school district receives, the different types of federal programs, what the current year budget has for reference point for these different grants, and then what is being projected to be spent next year in 2016-17. And so what we're doing is projecting how much will be received and spent, since it's all flow through, in 2016-17. Doctors Julie McCarger and Mary Clark are here. They head up the Federal Programs and Grants Office. We've got a number of others here who can speak to some of the specifics of the others. I'll go through a few, or several actually, of these grants and then open it up for any questions that anyone might have. The first is, and by far the largest, would be Title I. I think most people are familiar with federal Title I funding. You can see that the projection is basically flat funding, going from 29.5 to an estimate of about $30.1 million for the entire school district to be received and spent next year. The vast majority of these funds are pushed out and allocated directly to schools. Then schools use their school improvement plans to determine how they want to budget and spend these federal Title I dollars. The next largest would be Idea funds, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Obviously this is for our exceptional education students. Projection is for a slight decrease in funding amount for next year. The amount projected to be received and spent, approximately $18.6 million. Then we have our new, still new, our federal pre-K grant, where we budgeted this year almost $6.3 million. Next year we're budgeting a little over $8 million for the federal pre-K grant to be spent. This, if you will remember, is a 4-year grant totaling approximately $33 million over the life of the grant. And so we can speak more to that if you'd like.
Okay.
The next is our School Improvement Grant, or SIG funds as we call them. Also included would be our iZone grants, $4.2 million projected to be received and spent next year. Our pre-K state funding, this would be existing and somewhat historical funding through the state for the state's voluntary pre-K program. You'll see remains steady at just under $3.9 million. Then Title II. Title II is for teacher and principal training and recruiting. We are projecting Title II funding to basically stay the same at just under $3.2 million. Title III is for our English learner acquisition, English language acquisition. Those funds total approximately $1.6 million is our projection for next year. And then Carl Perkins for our CTE, or Career and Technical Education Program. Those funds projected about $1.3 million for next year. Not going to go through all of these. I wanted to touch on the ones, the larger ones, those that exceeded $1 million. I will mention, you can look in the middle of the page, we have a new grant, a new I3 grant, Grow STEM, which we're projecting to receive and spend $466,000 next year. And then you can see that there are several grants that are ending, of course, Race to the Top. Some of the other grants that we have received in the past, those have sunset and are ending, and you'll look in the 2016-17 column and see that $0 are being projected there. We always include a contingency in anticipation of any new or additional grant awards. Of course, this is all dependent upon what's received. Nothing is spent that isn't received, and because we are a reimbursable state, and so we spend before we actually receive. And so that $5 million would just be a placeholder for any, in anticipation of any new or additional grant awards. So with that, Ms. Pierce, I'll open it up for any questions. And again, we've got people in the audience who can speak to any of these grants that people may have questions about. And I know there was a specific question as it related to federal funding and grants as it, in regards to student assessments.
Right. Do we have questions?
I do. I have a couple myself. The reduction in funds for the career and technical education, is there a reason for that?
I'll ask Dr. McCarter if she knows. It's just a slight reduction. It may very well be just the difference in carryover funding going from one year to the next, where the carryover funding might have been less, is being projected to be less than the prior year, but I don't know. It's showing going from 1.45 million to about 1.3 million. Julie, do you know anything more than that about the Carl Perkins?
No, but we got that estimate because it's actually appears in, we have something called the E-Plan, which is the electronic grants management system, and the state will post the amounts for certain grants. And for the Carl Perkins CTE grant, that's what they posted, so we included that as our estimate. Did you want to speak anything else to that?
No, that's just what we actually have, and we are projecting flat funding. So the one last year was probably projected a little high, but now we know this is the actual amount.
Okay, all right. And secondly, I think I mentioned this to you the other day, Chris, the I3 grant that we got for Growth STEM, are those funds earmarked already for specific programs? Do we know that?
I'll let Drs. McCarter and Clark
Well,
speak to
actually, I want to say, I'll let Dr. Clark speak to this. She was instrumental in helping to develop and acquire that grant, so I'll let her speak exactly. That grant, just one thing, that grant is actually an evaluation grant, and that's why it's I3. So we develop a program and we evaluate it, and the evaluation gets disseminated nationally. So I'll have Mary talk a little bit about the actual program and what its components are.
This grant will serve students in the middle schools in the Overton, Hunters Lane, and Stratford cluster with the goal of increased STEM course taking and increased attendance in the STEM academies in those high schools. Bailey, Croft, Goodlettsville, Lytton, Madison, McMurray, and Oliver will have programs. The programs will be extended learning programs after school, Saturday, and summer camps to increase achievement in STEM subjects and to increase, as I said, interest, engagement, course taking in the STEM academies. They will be targeting high-need students. The program is being planned now under our Director of STEM, Dr. Chris Elliott, and his team.
And what were the three clusters again?
Hunters Lane, Overton, and Stratford, based on the STEM academies and the matriculation in those academies of high-need students to increase that.
Okay, thank you.
Well, let me also add, one of the purposes of the grant is open to both boys and girls, but one of the purposes is to increase the participation of girls, particularly in those clusters, in STEM academies, especially engineering, technology, those kinds of STEM academies. So that will be one of the things we'll also be measuring and looking at through these activities, through mentoring. Do we have more girls that are going and choosing those academies and then hopefully pursuing careers in those areas?
Great, thank you.
Jill?
Yes, I'd like to ask about Title IIA, Teacher and Principal Training and Recruiting. Could you talk a little bit about that? And also, I'm particularly interested in evaluations of those practices.
Okay, well, Mary is actually the Title II project director, and I also, let me just, before we get into specific programs, also, as you all are aware, No Child Left Behind is sunset. We have a new act, it's called Every Student Succeeds Act. The actual grants that are currently were in No Child Left Behind will carry over basically the funding, the formula, and certain requirements for one more year before they get transitioned. Title IIA is one of the programs that will continue under Every Student Succeeds Act. I'll let Mary talk about specifically what we're doing with the money and what we have been doing, and how we would evaluate the effectiveness of those.
The Title IIA is directed at professional development for teachers and principals in increasing the effectiveness of teachers and principals in our district. And the funding for this year will go to providing coaches to the non-Title I schools who do not get that funding from the Title I to use in their school-based budgeting. So they'll get a coach from this grant. Other initiatives include a lead numeracy coach, the district lead coaches that develop the curriculum and assessments, and with the Kelly Henderson, the Director of Curriculum and Leadership, technology designers, instructional designers to help schools develop their blended learning and other initiatives, international baccalaureate coach, technology lead coaches, a lot of comp coaches. Most of these are in personnel, have to do with professional development and coaches. In addition, there are some funding for Ideea and Montessori and other professional development initiatives. The TEL survey is funded by this initiative.
I think she would also like to address, how do we evaluate that these dollars have an impact on student achievement in the district?
And we evaluate how these dollars have an impact on student achievement of the district by taking the APF, and we evaluate the increase in the scores and the needs for the schools. When we allocate resources going forward, we look at the needs based on those kinds of data.
Thank you. Anything else?
Yeah, I just want to go back to the STEM line for just a second. I apologize, Ms. Shepherd, I lost track of where you were. But the 3 clusters that you mentioned, are those the only clusters that have STEM-focused academies?
Well, no. There are other high schools that have STEM-focused academies, such as, I think, Hillwood has like healthcare. Why we picked those 3 were we were looking for the academies that had disproportionate enrollment and participation of males.
Okay.
Not females, and we kind of cracked that open, and those academies were located in these 3 clusters. But if you look at other, what you might call STEM academies, such as healthcare, you're not going to see this discrepancy. Gotcha. So part of what motivated the grant, after talking with our colleagues over career academies, was actually looking at the data, and also knowing that in Nashville and nationally that there is a big movement to increase the number of women in technology, engineering fields. So that drove the high schools we were looking at, and then drove the middle schools that feed into those high schools, and try to address, catch the girls early. And this is not just for girls, but the primary driving factor, and one of the things we're looking at, is the participation and more equitable participation of females in those kinds of academies.
And the curriculum for some of this aftercare will be this engineering by design. Engineering is elementary. It is addressing the hard STEM academies, the hard sciences, you know, the engineering, computer science, coding, those sorts of fields that, as she said, have disproportionate male attending over female. We have some partners who've already committed a match. 15% of the grant is matched with funds from the Nashville Technology Council, Project Pencil, the Pencil Foundation, Alignment Nashville, and NASA, the Nashville After Zone Alliance. So we have some great partners already, and we're just in the planning stage.
Anybody else?
I'll go ahead and ask the question, if that's okay, that was presented at a previous meeting. As far as the different federal funds and grants, are there some of these that require student assessments?
Right,
And if so,
we've
which
partnered,
ones?
okay, I'm sorry.
And if so, which ones, and
Oh, okay.
and how many, and just any details you
Oh,
can
okay.
provide as it relates to student assessment requirements to receive any of these federal funds or grants?
So we've worked with our colleague, Dr. Changas, to summarize kind of the connections between various grants and any assessments that go along with those grants.
What I have is an updated version of the information we share every year on our testing calendar and the applicable federal law, state law. And we've added to this not only the description of the assessment, but also in purpose, but also the amount of time required. And most of these assessments, particularly on the first two pages, are required by federal law. As Dr. McCarger said, the Every Student Succeeds Act, which has replaced NCLB, requires English language, arts, and math and science assessments every year. And we have the 3 through 8 assessments on the first page. In addition to the required assessments, the state has a social studies assessment, which is part of state law, but not tied to federal funds. On the second page are the high school assessments, which include the 10 ready math and English language arts subjects, and also we're required to do the biology and chemistry for science. The optional from federal purposes is end of course exam. Page 3, our assessments tied to English learners and assessment of English proficiency, our WEDA access assessments are also tied to the new law and to the federal funding. And there's not a specific dollar amount tied to any specific assessment. We're required to comply with the federal law with regard to the administration of these assessments. And I know Dr. McCarter can speak more to the potential ramifications, but you know, our federal funds are tied to administration of those assessments. And they're also all used for our accountability purposes. The remaining assessments are either required by state law, such as the ACT assessment, or are assessments that are in our portfolio assessments on page 5. And our National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is administered on, which is also on page 5, which is administered to a small sample of schools. The only things not tied to state or federal law are our digital literacy assessment, which is in support of State Board of Education policy, our district benchmark assessments that we use to monitor school performance over time, and our text level assessments. But all of the other assessments are state-required assessments. So, Dr. Carter, do you want to speak a little bit about it, and having worked in federal programs at the state level?
Yeah. So, although the federal law requires the assessment, it's really the state that has to meet that requirement to develop a plan and assessments and accountability system that has to be approved by the U.S. Department of Ed under federal law. Our state, as has many other states, have also then passed state laws that also require those assessments, and in addition to, like the social studies, social science assessment, which is not required by any federal law, but is required by state law. So it's kind of difficult to talk about any of the grants actually tied to dollars, because they're actually, all of them are tied to dollars through either assessments or through evaluations that rely on the results of student assessments.
Does that help? I know Ms. Spearing, we had talked about this in terms of just trying to figure out if there are ways to reduce any of this. It doesn't sound like there is, if they're tied back to.
Well, as far as the state assessments, I don't think there are any ways to take any shortcuts here. I will say that we've just learned today, and it's nothing official yet, but the 10 ready assessments, the state assessments that were given or will be given twice this year are going to be a one-time assessment next year. There's supposed to be an official announcement next week, which will help somewhat in terms of the timing. The Explore and Plan assessments given in 8th and 10th grade as part of college readiness are going away. They're on here with lines through them. And we're reassessing all of the assessments, including the missed practice tests, which if you look at the test dates shown on here are to be determined. That's on page 5. It's very likely that there will not be a state requirement for those assessments to be given this year, since we've been through the process once, and those would be left up to schools for their own use. But we're also looking at some of the assessments that we're giving that could be used potentially as universal screeners, including our benchmark assessments, to replace the screening that we're currently doing in certain grade levels. But we'll have to have that conversation with the state. But we are sensitive to the concerns about the assessment time, and this year in particular has been quite an interruption.
Okay. Thanks. And I have one quick question. Is the threshold to receive Title I at a school 50%?
Well,
Students with free and reduced
the
lunch?
district has some discretion
Okay.
on making that cutoff point. So we could go down to, for example, 40%. I think I mentioned before, though, you have a certain amount of money. This year, we're projecting a little over $30 million. And you do have to allocate enough funds to schools to actually have an impact. And those funds have to be concentrated at the schools that have the greatest need, i.e., in this case, the largest number and percent of children in poverty. So I think Mary actually can tell you exactly how many schools next year that we think will be, well, that we're projecting to be Title I and then non-Title I.
And we're basing these projections on a 50% poverty. We have 139 Title I schools for next year, which is 86% of our schools. We have 23 non-Title I schools, which is 14%. Now, that includes all of our schools, charter, non-charter, all schools. But that's what we have, 86% are Title I, it's 139.
And so, Julie, could you give what the requirement is as far as a district has to provide funding at a certain level? Is it 70% or 75%?
Well, any school that has 75% or more poverty has to be served by Title I. And honestly, a lot of our schools are at that level, as you probably all are aware. I mean, right now, is what I think Mary said, we only have 23 schools that don't meet that 50% poverty, and that's 14% of our schools.
And of course, the lower the percentage, the more it's spread across schools and students, which means the less per pupil students.
Right, and then the
schools
less
receive.
impact it's going to have in our schools that have students with the highest need, i.e. in poverty. So we do conduct surveys with principals and other key stakeholders on their opinions about Title I, about what they would like to see, including asking them, for example, about this whole thing, where would you set the cutoff point? We're collecting those right now. We don't have them all in place, but we then collect them and aggregate those survey results to provide input on some of the decisions we make, and go to the executive leadership team to help guide the best use of these funds and some degree of flexibility we have in making those decisions.
Just a huge number are 75%. And I can provide the board, if ever they would like, a list of the Title I schools and their poverty and their allocations.
Yeah, okay.
Could you send that to Cameo, please?
Sure.
She can send it to the board members.
That'd be great. Thank you. Are there any more questions on federal?
Yeah, I want to go back to the testing again. Paul, maybe you can help me understand, because I know it's difficult because schools do various testing and practice for testing individually, and it's not synonymous across the district. But can you give us a kind of a ballpark figure of what the range is in terms of numbers of hours of testing for a third or fourth grader, and practice, and some of the lowest number of, what is the range?
Well, I can't give you exact numbers. I can tell you that in terms of the state mandated assessments, including the screenings, universal screenings we do, and the 10 Ready and state assessments, that we're probably, in terms of testing time, we're talking about typically in the neighborhood of 20, 25 hours. Now, there's time before and after that in terms of setting up for the testing. The practice test that we did last year, we cut back on the second assessment and made it optional, but it involved a few more hours of testing at the student level. But that's at the individual student level. We know there's a disruption across the school that's beyond that, as you have multiple grades testing. There was a lot of practice time last year getting used to an online format, which of course ended up not being the way we administered 10 Ready. And that varies by school. There was time just in terms of students developing keyboarding skills and so forth. We do not survey schools. We know some of the products that are being used in schools. We don't survey them in terms of all the assessments that they're using. That may be, we've talked about that internally as something that we may want to collect. I certainly want to look at some of the products that are used more often to see if there's any relationship in terms of student achievement. Personally, I think sometimes we go a little overboard in terms of the practice tests and the format. The instructional piece is critical, and if we have that in place, it should translate to the assessments. And getting used to a test format sometimes shouldn't be our primary goal. But I know that typically we're talking about the neighborhood of no more than 25 to 30 hours per student per year that's required. But I also know, that there's a lot that goes on beyond that. And if that's something the board would like us to pursue, we can try to gather more data on that. We hear anecdotal reports on that.
So just in the interest of time, Ms. Pierce, I know we have a student performance that needs to get set up. If we can just get into nutrition services fund and forego the other questions section if that goes long. If you have any additional questions, please forward them to Ms. Pierce and Ms. Shepherd so they can prepare to address those at the next time that we meet.
So if you'll look at the second document, cover page, Nutrition Services Fund, again, this is a separate fund. This is a self-supporting enterprise fund, doesn't require the use of any local tax dollars. And if you turn to the second page, it shows the budgeted revenue on the top part of the page and budgeted expenditures on the bottom part. You can see as far as budgeted revenue goes, by far the largest source of revenue for the Nutrition Services Fund is USDA meal reimbursements, which is estimated around $45.4 million in revenue. As the board knows, our school district embarked on community eligibility and provision, which allowed for no-cost meals to all of our students, no-cost breakfast, no-cost lunch. And so you won't see anything on here regarding any student payments for meals. You will see some dollars here, almost $2.2 million for à la carte sales, where we still do provide à la carte options and selections for our students that they could pay for if they so choose. And there's a little bit of state matching funds here in the Nutrition Services Fund, but not much. Total budgeted revenue of a little over $52.1 million. Budgeted expenditures, the largest would be, as far as, would be regarding staff. We've got salaries and benefits at the top. The second largest, of course, would be food purchases at almost $20 million budgeted for food. And then a series of other line items for expenditures, including utilities. The food service, or the Nutrition Services Fund, does pay for its share of utilities in all of our kitchens. You can see the budget is for expenditures to match budgeted revenue of a little over $52 million. If you go to the next page, it basically just shows expenditures in the same format as our document number nine in the operating budget. It shows current number of positions, current budget, position changes, budget changes, resulting in proposed positions and proposed budget. Again, the total $52.1 million, just shown, I guess, a different way. The next page, we include this for our 10-month support employees and our operating budget on document number 3. We show it here in the same format regarding employee work calendars, and you can see it's based on the number of student days, 175 student days. There are 16 days that these employees are paid for time off. That would be vacation and holidays. And there are other days these employees are paid for things such as orientation, training, and administrative days where the employees come in and work that are not student days. Then you can see to the far right the total number of paid days by the different positions in the Nutrition Services Fund. And then the last page here in this document would be our year-to-date meal count comparisons. It's broken down between total meals and then breakfast and lunch. And so since this only goes through February, since we haven't closed out March, it's probably easier to look at the bottom of this chart at the ADP number, which is average daily participation, and you can see the bottom line ADP difference. There's been an increase in total meals, an increase in breakfast, and an increase in lunch this year compared to last year, 2014-15. So that's the Nutrition Services Fund budget in a nutshell. We have Spencer Taylor, Sheila Clark, and some others from our Nutrition Services office who are here to answer any questions that anybody might have.
Any questions?
Feed the children, feed the kids.
Feed the kids. No questions? Thank you for that. Well, we do, as Dr. Gentry said, if you could get your questions, we have one more week. We have next Tuesday that we have an hour allotted to continue to walk through specific parts of the budget and questions we are having during our regular board meeting, a presentation on the teacher compensation part of the budget increase. So if you would, go ahead in the next couple of days leading up to next week, send your questions to Ms. Shepherd and myself, as well as Cameo, so we can get those ready to be answered next Tuesday. Is there anything else? We can go ahead and let the students set up. We have a performance in here at 4:45. So thank you all for your presentations and your time. We're adjourned.